Kia ora, e ngā mana, ko hui mai nei ki tēnei rorohiko, ki te kōrero i ngā whakaro, ka nui te aroha. Welcome to our Meet the Candidate session with Ben Wylie-Van Eerd, our candidate for Hutt South. And of course, it's also Te Wiki o Te Reo Māori. Kia ora, Ben.
Kia ora, Geoff. Thanks for that introduction. Something I've really fallen behind in my Te Reo studies since I started being a candidate. Suddenly there's all this other stuff that you've got to do and it gets in the way.
I do remember that you have done quite a lot of research into the local iwi in this area, though, in the Whanganui-a-Tara area.
Yeah, I mean, partly in combination with my work, we have this sort of partnership with Te Atiawa. Went to have a stay over at their marae, and they talked about their their elders and their ancestors and the stories that they had of the real geography of Wellington, of the whole harbour. Their hapu and their iwi, I visited them on the Waifetu marae, but they have a story of the whole of the Wellington region. Of course, there's the marae down in Thorndon, which is also a historic place from them. And I thought I really liked this little story that they had one of the rivers, the Korokoro stream, actually was quite significant to them as well, because it was an important source of fresh water for them. Lots of cool stories. Yeah. I've been to see their they have a museum which houses their waka, and it's an amazing story, actually, seeing as this is the week of Te Reo Māori. It's I love the story of this. They were asked on an anniversary of the founding of Wellington. I can't remember which one, could have been 50, could have been something else. They were asked to do a reenactment of their iwi welcoming in settlers to Petone Beach. And they were really excited to do this, but the knowledge of how to paddle and carve waka had been lost to their iwi. It wasn't something that they had anymore, but they used their connections with Taranaki iwi and their other iwi groups. They got an expert in. He came down. He taught them how to carve the waka, and they all participated in how to paddle the waka. And so they actually picked that skill back up, even though it had been lost to them locally, because they had these networks of into Ao Māori all around the country. And I thought that was just an amazing story. Yeah, nice.
And so what's your background, Ben? Obviously with a name like Wylie-Van Eerd, it sounds like you have European heritage.
That's right. No, all of my ancestry that I know of is European. One half of my family, my mother's side, has been in New Zealand for 5 or 6 or 7 generations. They came to New Zealand near Dunedin and started the Arthur Allison's son mattress company many years ago.
Wow.
In sort of living memory, that included the feather down. Am I getting that right? I might have that wrong. The feather down, sleeping bags and jackets and that kind of fairy down, sleeping bags and jackets and that kind of stuff. That was something from my antecedents on my mother's side. My father was born in a little village called Wechel in the Brabant region of Nederland. And since graduating from university, I've gone actually to stay and live in the Netherlands for a few years, although not, I have to say, in Wechel. They did not have a lot of high-tech scientific research positions in Wechel itself, but I did visit there many times.
So you are a physicist in terms of training?
That's right, yeah. I went to university pretty much straight out of school, did my degree, did my honours, did my PhD, and then headed off overseas. That was all at Victoria University of Wellington, so that's sort of my academic whakapapa, so to speak. My PhD supervisor is a man called Professor Joe Trodal, who has links to Japan and Switzerland, the Lausanne research group there. And I I was very privileged to get to meet his PhD supervisor, who is still living. He came to do a bit of a world tour and stopped off in Wellington to visit all of his PhD students around the world. There's a man called Frank Blatt, and he's also sharp as anything, even though he must be something like 90 by now. So I'm hoping that doing something like this keeps your mind fresh.
Yeah, academic whakapapa, I hadn't really thought of that before, but it is quite interesting. And that's what I really enjoyed about yeah, I really enjoyed that about learning Māori, was actually getting forced to go and research my own background, which I'd never done before. And it's so interesting, and such a a really interesting perspective on the world to really look back at where you've come from.
It's kind of an embarrassing story for me. The first time that I really found out in any depth about my the New Zealand side of my history was when I did a student exchange in Pennsylvania in the States for 6 months. And one of the classes I did there, an anthropology class, was asking us to bring something to like study group of our family history. And I thought, well, New Zealand's got a thing for this, right? We've got the whole, pepeha, the mihi nui, the story of your descent, and I thought that was a great thing to share with people. But to my shame, I had not actually looked into it very, very much until then. So I had a couple of cool conversations with my grandmother leading up to that assignment. I really enjoyed it. But it's funny how I still think of myself as a young person. Like, I went to school relatively recently, and it was still only a very shallow level that we got taught there. I got to say, this is my parents, this is my grandparents, this is my mountain, and this is my river. But even then, the mountain and the river that we were talking about were just the local ones to the school mostly. We didn't really look into the story or what they meant to our ancestors, or if there was something else other than a river or a mountain that was more meaningful to our individual ancestors and might have been something from which you could get a more meaningful connection when you share that whakapapa with someone else.
Nice. Yeah. Hey, so for our viewers, if you have questions for Ben, we will start taking your questions in a few minutes. As I mentioned, he's our candidate for Hutt South, and was also involved in the creation of the innovation policy. He is, as we're discussing now, he is a scientist. So any questions in that sort of area, or if you just want to get to know him better, feel free to send those through. So
is somebody going to ask the questions? Because I'm not reading anything right now.
Okay, I'll
cool.
ask the questions. Don't worry, Ben. The interesting thing that I found out about when I researched my whakapapa was, well, it was a lot of interesting stuff, but most of my family are sort of have been based up in Taranaki and the Waikato since coming to New Zealand. Mm-hmm. But what I discovered was that the boat that the ship that my most distant ancestors actually arrived in was very, very early on, and it was here in Wellington, it was supposed to land in Auckland. It was a ship called the Oxford, but they actually lost two of their masts on the journey, and so had to limp into Wellington because I think back then that was where it was when things got fixed. It was here.
Obviously, they can't have been using our good New Zealand Cody masts, otherwise they would have lasted the whole time, I'm sure.
Yeah. It was probably cheap pine. But yeah, and so actually, my family's whakapapa story in Aotearoa begins in Wellington, so it's kind of cool to be back here now.
That is interesting, and it's also interesting that the ship that my ancestors arrived in was called the Surat, and it had I think it was an even more ill-fated ship than the ones that your ancestors came in on, Geoff, because they were headed towards Dunedin, and they'd been going there from I forget the place where it was in England, somewhere in England. They were doing the sailing over. It had a long voyage. They finally got within sight of the land. They knew where they were. That was great. But then everyone got drunk, and the ship just ran aground on a sandbar. And that was the end of the Surat. My ancestors had to walk from where it sort of ran aground after waiting a few days, and it became obvious that nothing was going to happen. They just had to get there themselves, and they had to leave a whole lot of stuff behind on that ship as well.
Wow. Where did it run aground?
On a sandbar near Dunedin is all I can tell you.
Okay, right, just somewhere near. Wow. Far out.
So there you go. Unlucky voyages leading to great lineages in New Zealand.
Hey, so in terms of, I mean, you mentioned you studied in Wellington, and then you spent some time over in Europe.
Nederland, yeah.
Yeah. So obviously that was, getting back to your roots. But what were you doing back there in terms of work and stuff?
Right. So I worked at a place called the University of Twente, which was in a town called Enschede. And they have a research group there that was working very closely together with Carl Zeiss, the optics manufacturer, and ASML, which is a company which makes the machines which make computer chips. So they don't make computer chips, they make the machines which make computer chips. It's all this lithography and projection stuff. And the specific problem that we were working on, well, not in my group, my personal project that we were working on there was that there's this big push in that field to get down from visible light to extreme ultraviolet light. The problem is that you can't just keep going shorter and shorter in wavelength, because at a certain point, all of your mirrors stop reflecting and all of your lenses stop bending the light appropriately. The materials become completely useless in that wavelength range, and you have to find a whole new set of materials. So actually, if you look at the history of that technology, the wavelength went down and down and down and down and down, and then they sort of hit this wall around about 150 nanometers. And then they ran into this problem. They said, oh, what are we going to do about this? So they had a bit of a go at making it smaller, realized that the problem was huge, set that aside as a long-term project, and then started working on all these clever things like three-dimensional architecture and immersion lenses and double exposure patterns, all of these things to still work with, by this stage, relatively coarse wavelength of light, but all of these little tricks to make it even smaller. And they're just sort of now coming to the point where they can start to bring that 10 or so nanometer wavelength light into production. It's taken them a long way. And the bit that I was working on was one of the sort of I like to think of it as the lens of the mirror of last resort, where if something's gone wrong in situ and they don't want to stop the machine and start everything over and replace all the parts, the mirror that I worked on has a little bit of adaptiveness to it. So you can key in some kind of change to the surface of the shape of the mirror, and it'll make that adjustment, and then that can compensate for things which go wrong in the rest of the system. So you extend the life of the whole system without having to break the vacuum, without having to stop the system, and you can keep it running for longer than that.
Right. Wow. And so
that makes sense.
Yeah. It's quite interesting stuff. And you mentioned that quite a lot of people quite a lot of Kiwi scientists will go and work overseas post getting a PhD in New Zealand.
Yes, that's very much the done thing. and likewise, a lot of people in overseas universities will come to do postdocs in New Zealand. The postdoc stage, especially, is a time in academia where there's such a fruitful exchange of information and people around the world. A lot of people from different countries come here. A lot of our people go abroad, and it's these big academic networks that get maintained and nourished that way. And I've been wondering, just while we've gone into these lockdown conditions in New Zealand, but also around the world, how young early career scientists are going to be affected by this. What is their career path going to look like? Is it still going to look like mine? Are people going to be able to find jobs overseas? And if not, how are they going to build those connections with the rest of the expertise that exists out there in the world? New Zealand is, I was about to say New Zealand is not an island, which well, not literally true, but we can't participate in this big scientific endeavor by closing ourselves off and being on our own. We have to find ways of communicating and really working together and collaborating.
Yeah. And what's your gig now?
What's my gig now?
What's your gig now? You work for GNS,
right? My gig, yeah. I work for Callaghan Innovation, and I work there as a research scientist. So I'm still
Oh,
working
yeah, it's not
with
GNS
innovative
anymore,
companies.
it's Callaghan.
Oh, heck, yeah, close enough.
And so what do you do now?
I'm a research scientist, and I work with ultrasonic transducers mostly. So we're looking at projects where they can be applied in industry and companies and all sorts of applications, how to develop.
What is an ultrasonic transducer?
Okay, so if you're getting an ultrasound scan, the doctor's going to get that little thing and they're going to press it up to you, whatever it is that's getting the ultrasound, the stomach, if you're looking at a baby to be. The thing which is shooting out that ultrasound wave is called a transducer. And also the thing which measures the signal coming back. It's usually the same thing, but it can be different depending on design of the device.
Cool. Hey, so first question of the night from Marianne.
Hi, Marianne.
Do TOP have a plan for funding science differently? CRIs spend a lot of time bidding for funding that could be spent on research.
Yeah, I mean, we do have a plan for funding science differently. Although I have to say it's not focused so much around the CRIs as it is the universities themselves. So the current way that university, or at least university research, is funded is something called a performance-based research fund. For all the other viewers who don't know, I'm sure Marianne knows all about this already. And basically it ranks the universities based on the research that they do, and according to a metric called publications and citations. So scientists who are working in academic fields and sort of far from the business end of things, they earn their reputation by publishing articles in academic journals. And then if those articles are found useful by other scientists, then other scientists will refer to that in the articles that they write. You know, whenever you write an article, you make reference to about 20 other or so, maybe more, pieces of work that have come before. And so this is how the edifice of science gets built up on what's existed before and keeps advancing. If you do a good job and this paper is really useful to other academic researchers, they'll cite you and say, this person did that work and we know because of that, blah, 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 blah. So this works really well for acknowledging people who are contributing well to the academic publishing side of things. But it has no acknowledgement for if our scientists are working with New Zealand businesses and New Zealand companies. And this is something that TOP would seek to change, because if you're only being funded based on your academic results, then any time that you take off to work with a New Zealand company, which you might want to do because they've got a great idea, it takes away from your funding. And because of the way the academic measures work, if you take some time off to do that, it keeps coming back to bite you on and on and on into the future. It's one of these things that you keep building up and up and up. And I hate to make this comparison, but it's a little bit like a parent deciding that they want to take more time off to spend with their child, and then they end up with a gap in their CV. It could be the same thing for an academic who decides that they want to take some time off to work with a company or a startup or something like that. There is going to be a gap in that, and by the PBRF, they have no way of acknowledging that work that's been done. So TOP wants to dismantle the PBRF and introduce a way to credit scientists who are working with business in addition to scientists who are working on academic fields.
Yeah, nice.
Short answer.
Great description. I mean, I do think we want to, reform the wider funding system as well to ensure that, scientists are doing larger, longer running projects so that they do spend less time bidding for funding rather than actually doing the research.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a wide acknowledgement in the sort of the science industry around New Zealand that too much time is spent writing proposals and not enough time is spent actually getting on and doing the research.
Yeah, but
completely agree that we need to find ways.
Sorry?
Yeah, completely agree that we need to do more about that. And particularly, I remember, this is years old knowledge now, so don't quote me on this. This might be out of date. But I remember I looked when I was still a student into projects that were I read some research about projects that were funded by the Cullen Fund, which is one of our big ways that you get money to do research in New Zealand. And the report by those people said that, look, we fund whatever it might have been, 10% of applicants, but actually there's something like 25 to 30% of applicants, which we think are excellent candidates. And if we had more money, we would have happily spent money on them as well. So when it comes to choosing between this 30%, we're really doing nothing better than flipping a coin. And we're spending an awful lot of effort to perform that coin flip that could otherwise be spent on, funding more research. At a certain point, because there's so much uncertainty involved, you're never going to build a full picture of what this research is going to produce before you actually get on and do it. And there's a limit to the usefulness of assessing it beyond a certain point.
Yeah. Another question here from Joe. What are your thoughts on tech innovation and turning New Zealand into the next Silicon Valley? What ways can we support and encourage international corporations to set up shop here and invest their money and hire lots of people and bring work to our shores?
Yeah, kia ora, Joe. That's a great question too. One major way that TOP would do that is by changing the tax system so that it doesn't favour housing anymore, and that people are rewarded for doing things like building up innovative businesses more than they currently are. There's a big gap in, if you're looking at the startup ecosystem in New Zealand, it's long been acknowledged that we've got this big gap in the $2 to $10 million investment sort of funding range. So companies in New Zealand, they can get some initial angel investment and some seed funding, and they can get going. But then they grow to the size where they, in order to take their next step to develop their product or to develop their market, they need an investment of somewhere between $2 and $10 million. And there's just this huge gap of that kind of funding in New Zealand. There's not enough of it to go around. So what you see is that firms grow and develop and get to that stage, and then they go away. They go away to the United States because that's where that funding is. So I mentioned that we want to reform the tax system so that investments in business, and especially growing business, can be more rewarded as well. But we also, I think this is a great area for the government to step in directly. It's got the scale to be able to fund a variety of projects and still, so that you're not getting killed by the variance, and you can have that economy of scale in the investment, which means that they can sort of persist in doing that. And it's also a great way. What TALP has recommended is that we develop an we develop an innovation fund specifically targeted at this gap in the market, and that we allow New Zealand public members to also invest in this fund, right? Because people don't invest just out of the goodness of their heart. They invest because they think there's a fair chance that this company might go huge. So there is an expected reward for doing this kind of investment. And I think there's a lot of New Zealanders who would be quite interested in getting in on that. I know that I personally looked for, when I was learning more and more about this, I said, oh, well, I've just got my money sitting around in like term deposits and in index funds, but I want to be doing more to support the startup scene in New Zealand. So I looked around for a sort of a retail investment product, I guess you would say, that allowed me to put my money into this kind of innovative business. I couldn't find one. People have sort of given me a trickle of suggestions over the years since then, but I found it very, very hard to do, especially compared to investing in companies that are already on the NZX or into a KiwiSaver. It was just really, really hard. So if we have a product which makes it easy for everyday, mum and dad investors to put some of their money into a high risk but high reward, but then also New Zealand focused product, I think that'd be a pretty good thing for that.
A bit of a change of tack now. A question more about Hutt South. The sitting MP in Hutt South.
Sorry for the alarm. That's reminding me to take my rubbish and recycling out. I did it already. I was well prepared.
Nice work. A question about Hutt South in particular. So the sitting MP in Hutt South is doing a pretty good job of being seen in the community. How are you planning to engage?
Is this a question about how I'm planning to engage if I am elected or during the campaign? Let me get
I assume they're meaning during the campaign, but maybe answer both. Maybe answer both.
Sure. Well, I mean, if I'm elected, I think Chris Bishop is doing a great job at being seen in the community and taking on a lot of local issues as well, maybe beyond the realm of parliamentary votes and bills and kind of stuff. I know he does do a lot of supporting of local causes, and honestly, I credit him with doing a pretty good job at doing that. I'd see him as an example to follow if I were elected. During the campaign, I'm pretty much self-funding this campaign. I don't have a huge amount of bandwidth, and I still have a full-time job. So I'm not going to be able to compete, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. I'm going to make sure that I'm at every single candidates debate that I can. And I've got a few signs up, like to go and visit people at the Riverside Market, if you're ever there, and if we start back up again, hopefully a week or two away, we'll be able to start the Riverside Market back up again. But I'm not running as big a campaign as some other candidates, and that's just what I'm able to contribute. From where I currently sit right now, I don't have a lot of time that I can afford to take off. I've got limited funds and a mortgage to pay. So yeah, campaigning within my means is what I'm doing, I'm afraid. I'd love to be able to do more.
No, that's totally, and I appreciate your candidness there. I mean, that is a massive advantage of the incumbents, right? I mean, both Chris Bishop and Ginny, even though Ginny's a list MP, they are both on parliamentary salaries. They have officers that are paid for. They have staff that are paid for. And they have their travel expenses that are paid for, and they're on pretty good parliamentary MP salaries themselves. So that is a mammoth incumbent advantage in terms of their ability to spend time in the community.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's just part of how the system works, unfortunately.
Yeah. But I mean, I think it is also worth acknowledging that both Chris and Ginny will almost certainly be in Parliament after the next election, regardless of the outcome of the election, right? And
polls looking like they are, no matter which one of them wins the electorate vote. I'm pretty confident that both of them will make it into Parliament.
Exactly. And they'll both continue to be representing the people of Hutt South, whether or not they are the MP for Hutt South. So, I mean, anyone in Hutt South could have a good look at Ben Wylie, because if you want a third member of Parliament, he's your man.
Plus, we're the only party which has any kind of coherent plan to solve the housing crisis, and everybody pays mortgage or rent. So,
yes,
might be a good reason to vote top there as well.
That's right. There are some questions here that I don't understand. Do you know what an erudite is? It's not spelled erudite, it's erudite. E-R-O-D-Y-T-E-E. No, I'm not sure what that means. If someone can...
Is that some kind of pun about the Education Review Office? Because if so, it goes for that question.
Erudite, yeah. Nice. If you want us to answer that string of comments, someone explain to us what's going on. A few questions here about what kind of demographics we're attracting. I mean, obviously, TOP does appeal to a younger voter in terms of, particularly ideas like, our housing policy, UBI, our focus on climate change all appeal to younger voters. But I mean, what response do you get from other demographics, Ben?
So the younger people are interested, and they're generally a little bit more aware of what TOP is doing than the other demographics are. But I think there's quite a lot of people who have heard of us, and when I go to markets, for example, people have heard of us and do want to ask me some questions, and I do get to spend some time with people, really getting to explain what the Opportunities Party would do for New Zealand and that kind of thing. And they're generally, look like they're 40s, I think, 30s, 40s. There's probably a big demographic of people who come up to me at the markets and talk to me. Maybe that's just me. And at candidates debates, I've had all sorts of people who have been interested in talking to me, all range of ages. I think you'll probably know more about the demographics of TOP as a whole than I do, but we're getting people of all ages.
One interesting thing that is that we do have quite a following amongst the the over 60s as well. And we like to call that group the grandparents that care, if you like. The ones that are often really concerned about the future of their mokopuna. And
they want to leave a good legacy for the people who come after them, and I think good on them for that. I really honor that.
Question here: how do we plan on raising the our profile for the party vote? I found myself looking up on your website after seeing the launch of the health policy, and really liked what I saw. And so thanks, Kirsten, for your question. I mean, this is election season, and so this is really the time when small parties get a chance to step into the limelight. You probably don't hear of us the rest of the time because the media don't talk about us too much, and we've really been saving our all of our guns in terms of advertising to focus on this period. So hopefully you will see plenty of our adverts over the next 5 weeks. But yeah, I mean, there really is an issue here in terms of media coverage, isn't there, Ben?
Yeah, no, there absolutely is. It's I'm getting so frustrated at reading columns written by journalists who are bemoaning the lack of interesting policy discussion going on in New Zealand politics right now, when we've been releasing policy after policy and press release after press release. And then, they act as if we don't even exist. I don't know if they're not aware of us or, but if they are, honestly, they've not been doing a particularly great job, in my opinion, because they're not there just to report on the people who sit in the Houses of Parliament. This is an election. And when I hear about I've heard some of our candidates are not being invited to, the Meet the Candidates kind of events that are being done around the country. And that just strikes me as so anti-democratic. Like, what do you have to do in order to get recognized? We have this system where you can put your name down to be an option on the ballot paper, and people aren't even giving you the opportunity to talk to the public.
And the whole point of MMP was to increase the diversity of voices in Parliament. Most European countries that have MMP have sort of 5 or 6 parties in Parliament with 10 to 30% of the vote each.
But it was like that in the Netherlands when I was there. But when I was in the Netherlands, there was actually an election while I was there, which I was able to vote in because I am also a Dutch citizen by birth. And there was a lot of worry in that election about Geert Wilders, who was what do they call them? The nationalists, they call them in the European context, the people who very anti-immigration, want to keep European nations European pure. And you did not end up getting into government in the end, but that was sort of one of those steps along the way that's led us to where we are today, I guess. Keystone events. Anyway, Kirsten, I think you were the one who asked this question. I just want to say to you, I don't want to spend any more time complaining about journalists and the media. It's not as if they're not having a hard enough time themselves with trying to get revenue out of Facebook and Google and all the rest of it. But so, in some ways, I think give them a break. But look, if you're interested in what the Opportunities Party is doing, then we really need you and everybody else who's listening and who's interested to be telling the people in your lives that, hey, I've learned about the Opportunities Party and I kind of like some of the things they're saying. Go and check out this maybe. Have those conversations with people. It's not going to be enough just the candidates going out and doing that. We need everybody who's interested, because this is how you develop power from outside of Parliament. You need to have broad support, and it only happens when people talk to people. You use your personal connections and say, hey, actually, I've realized that this is important to me, and I would like you to have a look at it for me.
Yeah, and I think Kiwis have kind of forgotten the importance of that sort of stuff. We a lot of people don't like to talk about politics because it's uncomfortable, but if you really do want change, then that is the way to do it, because there's no replacement for face-to-face contact. No amount of advertising can beat exactly what you're talking about.
That's the thing. There's no royal road. Parties that get into Parliament in New Zealand have to have broad support, and broad support comes from people talking to people. It doesn't come from a Facebook ad campaign. It doesn't come from a TV ad campaign. It doesn't come from driving past a billboard and thinking, damn, that guy's really good looking, I'm going to vote for him. It comes from people talking to people in the kitchens and in the coffee rooms, and that's what we really need if TOP is going to succeed. So if I have any questions for you guys, requests for you guys, that's it. Go and talk to somebody you know about TOP tomorrow.
Nice. Question for you, Ben. If you so forget that you're being interviewed by the leader of TOP here. If you get into Parliament, what is the one thing that you would want to get across the line for a government to implement? Say if you're working, assuming you're working with Labour, if Labour wins.
Yeah, assuming that I and nobody else from TOP somehow gets into Parliament and I'm seat number 61 in the New Zealand Parliament and I have the casting vote. Yeah.
Yes.
The biggest issue for New Zealand, I think, is the unaffordability of rent and housing in this country. It's something, yes, it takes food and medicine away from people who are poor, but it takes luxuries away from people who are wealthy as well. And I don't think people really realize that. And worst of all, it takes capital away from our businesses who are trying to grow. Every single life in New Zealand negatively affected by how expensive it is to live in this country. It's not just housing, but housing is definitely the number one factor in all of those kinds of things. We need to get the cost of rent and housing down. And Labour is not willing to do it. National is not willing to do it. Greens would like to do it, but we don't think that they have the right policy solution. TOP is the only party which has got a plan to bring rent and housing down. I guess having made that claim, it probably begs me to back it up. So I'll give you a really quick rundown of what the Opportunities Party would do. I've always wondered why are there not more houses? Everybody wants a house. We've got so much demand for houses, but more houses aren't being built. If this were a purely perfectly functioning market, you would expect that should be impossible, right? But we have a whole bunch of problems when it comes to building more housing supply. So we've got number one, building materials are too expensive in this country. Number two, the consent process in this country is too long and it's also too expensive. Number three, land prices are way too expensive. Number four, local government in New Zealand does not have the funding it needs to maintain existing infrastructure and build new infrastructure, which will allow them to make more, especially denser housing, but any kind of housing actually. And number five, because of the way the law works in New Zealand, councils have to guarantee that nothing goes wrong in the building process. If something does go wrong, then they are liable. Councils are pretty much all at their debt ceilings, so they look at every new thing, every new bill as a liability on their books, which they kind of have to in order to financially survive. That's a lot of problems, but TOP does have a way around all of them. We're going to introduce more competition in the building materials market and get an easier and faster route for materials which have been approved in overseas markets into New Zealand. There's no reason we have to duplicate all of that effort. Maybe that made sense 50 years ago, but now, honestly, we should be working closer together with other countries so that we can get an easier path for new materials into New Zealand. We need to reform the RMA, and this is the one point I think that all parties in Parliament now agree on. It has to be something which is more permissive of building, and it has to be something in which the appeals process is not at the end to just endlessly extend the process of getting the consent. Get the consent at the beginning of the process, and then you can move forwards much faster and much cheaper. We need to bring housing into the tax system. There's been a tax working group every 4 or so years for the last 16, and every single time they tell the New Zealand government, you need to tax housing, otherwise you're just going to keep going up and up and up, and people are not going to be able to afford housing. We need to bring housing into the tax system, and that's something that only TOP is planning to do. We also need to fund local government a whole lot more. Our plan is to give local government the GST component of any new builds. It does two things. It gives them the money that they need to build that infrastructure, develop that infrastructure like wastewater, local roads, electricity lines, that kind of thing. And it also incentivizes them to say yes to new development, because when they get the money is when they say yes to a new build. And finally, we're going to make sure that every new build in New Zealand has got to have external insurance, so that it's not the councils which are left on the hook if anything goes wrong. So there you go, 5 problems, 5 solutions. All the other parties in government between them are willing to do one of those 5 things. TOP will do 5.
Nice. Ka pai Ben, great summary. I just think, I don't know, are you using your hands? Is that sometimes muffling the microphone on your computer? I'm not sure.
Oh, that could be. I can't hear myself on the computer. I'll leave my hands out of it from now on. Good tip.
Yeah. Nice. Someone emailing say, can we give Naomi a shout out at the Waikato candidate debates? Kia ora.
Yeah, absolutely. Go Naomi.
Yeah.
Naomi's, for those of you who don't know, has written education policy, and she's a really, really smart cookie. She spent a lot of time with people in the sector and the ECE sector particularly. She knows her stuff, and she can beat the pants off of Labour and National's education spokespersons any day.
Nice. Question from William. Do you guys support fees-free tertiary education? If not, why?
We don't support it, and purely because we don't think it's the best value for money that we could for government money, government spending that we could have in terms of encouraging more people to take up higher education. Studies have shown that the best thing we can do to get more people into higher education is to focus on early childhood education. We've had 3 years actually of fees-free education, and the reports that have been done on it doesn't show that there's been more people taking up education than was the case beforehand.
Yeah.
That's not to say that we don't want to support students. To support students instead, of course, would bring in our universal basic income. So that means that every student would have a student allowance. It'd be $250 per week, which is more generous than the current student allowance. Of course, you don't have to pay that back. It's not like a student loan. So we definitely want to support students and make sure that it's a realistic option for people to improve their education and seek better careers. But fees-free doesn't seem to be a very good value for money way of making that happen. We prefer our UBI and our investment into early childhood education. And since government resources are limited, we want to shift things out of what's not working very well and put it into stuff that we think is going to work better. Nice.
Yeah, I mean, the incredible fact that sort of blows me away is that some kids from poorer households turn up to school 2 years behind their classmates developmentally, and that gap just persists right throughout our education system. I mean, our teachers work hard to help them catch up, but it's just too much of a gap to catch up. So that's why so many of those, so few of those kids, once they're 17, struggle to go on to university. But and it makes sense, right? Because if you think they've still got this 2 year gap, so they're effectively like 15-year-olds, and you'll remember what it was like being 15. If you're thinking you're trying to sit university entrance at the age of 15, it's bloody hard. So that 2 year gap is really what early childhood education is designed to close. If we get all our kids turning up to school ready to go, then it gives them the best chance.
Yeah, no, of course, there are a lot of things. I mean, calling it a 2 year gap is a little bit sterile. There'll be real meaningful struggles that those people and those families would have been through in order to get to where, get to where they are now. But like the developmental consequences of not having enough to eat, of being too cold and having respiratory diseases caused by insecure housing, the failure to establish meaningful connections at schools if you keep being moved around from school to school. There's a lot of really harsh things going on that, these are real problems, and this is where a lot of the less well-off in society, and it takes so long to get over these things, not just in terms of educational achievement, but in terms of recovering from trauma is really what we're talking about. Poverty is a kind of trauma, and it creates pathways in your brain that inhibit your progress in life, and it takes real therapy and real work to get over those. I know how difficult that can be. So to all of those of you who are on that journey, I want to apply to you. Keep going. It doesn't always look positive. If you keep going, you will see results, I promise you.
Nice. Lot of comments here. Appreciate that you're so proactive on Facebook and Instagram. Talking about our work on social media. And do you want to give a shout out to if people want to follow your page, Ben?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. You can, if you type Wylie-Van Eerd into Facebook, I have every confidence that you'll find me. I'm one of 2 Wylie-Van Eerds in the entire world. Hutt's Ben Wylie-Van Eerd, top candidate for Hutt South, I believe, is the name of the page. And you can follow that for updates. I posted some of the town hall debates that I've had in there, some articles that I find interesting. Yeah, 1 or 2 just photos of fun stuff, but mostly quite serious.
Nice. Question about tax, which you may or may not feel comfortable to answer, Ben, but the question is, any thoughts on the difference between your property tax and the universal capital gains tax?
Sure, yeah. Well, you can chip in if I'm saying anything wrong, Geoff, because I'm sure you understand this better than me. But the really key thing that sets our housing tax apart is that it's very, very carefully avoids double taxing assets. So if you've got a house and you're running it as a rental, and you generate an income and you pay income tax on that asset, then you've paid tax on that asset. If you introduce a universal capital gains tax on top of that, then you are actually taxing people who do that twice. And I know that everybody hates landlords, and honestly, I get it, but I think we need to focus on things which are going to solve the problem, not punishing those who are benefiting from our broken laws. In the top situation, you don't do that, which means that you now start to address the fundamental thing which is causing this overinvestment of the housing market, which is the high rate of tax on businesses, which include rentals, although rentals still get away with less than most other businesses, and low rate of, sorry, put my hands in front of the microphone, my low rate of tax on housing. You have to do something to increase that gap. And putting a universal capital gains tax on it just does this. The gap's still there, it's just higher up. What we need to do is this.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, because that's right. Because a capital gains tax applies to businesses as well as property, and our businesses are already taxed some of the highest taxes in the world. So you're right. We need to close that gap rather than just shift the whole thing up.
Yeah, I have to be honest with you, Geoff. I'm a bit of a lefty at heart, and I don't even have that strenuous an objection to a wealth tax, but it just strikes me as so much more important, even though I have that feeling, to equalize this than it is to do some kind of a wealth tax like that.
Well, I mean, it's interesting you say that, Ben, because the Greens like to point to Switzerland as a successful example of a wealth tax, and they do have a wealth tax. It's about 1%, and that actually does work quite well because it applies to housing and businesses and all that sort of stuff across the board. But the fact is that their business tax rate is 8%. It's tiny, so it's
is that so, Geoff?
Yeah. So it's quite a different context, how these different taxes interact. The gap between the tax on businesses and housing in Switzerland is very small. So there's not that incentive to invest in housing like there is here. Interesting question here, and it's specifically about cannabis legalization, but it's a very broad question in terms of talking to people about top policies in general. How do you talk to people that value anecdotal evidence over statistics, over facts? And they're talking about cannabis legalization as an example, but yeah, it's a pretty broad question.
So, I mean, this has come up for me when I've done door knocking and things like that. You often come up with people who have differences of opinion with you, and they have the things which underpin their beliefs, and you have the things which underpin your beliefs. I like to act on the basis of published academic research and good statistics, and when I have that, I make it is an effort to look at new research and to change your beliefs accordingly. Humans have biases. That's just the way that we're built, and overcoming them is a bit of effort. But look, if I come up and talk to somebody who has their own belief, I don't do that much to try and shift their belief on that. They've got their belief, they've got their underpinnings of it. I'm not going to change their mind, right? That's just not going to happen. All I think it is my duty to do is to tell them what my perspective is and why I believe what I believe. I'm not going to try and challenge them on their belief. I'm just going to say, well, I believe this differently. I believe that the evidence from Canada and the other places where cannabis has been legalized shows that you in fact see a slight decline in youth usage. You don't see an explosion in the amount of harm that's being done, and you do see reduction in funds going to criminal organizations. They'll say, "Oh, I still don't like it," and I say, "Well, that's all right, but my belief is this."
Yeah.
You don't change people's mind in one conversation. That's not how human beings work. All you're there to do is tell them what you believe. And if they ask, if they're interested, you can have that conversation on that level with them. But not everybody is interested in having a conversation on that level. And if they're not interested in that conversation, don't try and force it on them.
Yeah. And asking questions to understand people's beliefs can be useful too, right? Like,
true. Yeah, no, that is a good one.
Delving into some of the anecdotes that they are talking to try and understand where they're coming from a little bit more can be a good way to get to have people starting to question how they've arrived at the conclusion they've arrived at, I guess.
Yeah. Epistemology is endlessly fascinating to me, Geoff. I'm always interested in knowing how people know what they know, or what reasons they have for their beliefs and their knowledge.
Nice. Hey, well, we've got time for one more question.
Make it a good one,
Ben. Well, yeah, unless if someone asks something that we can answer quick after this, then by all
sure.
means. But the last chunky question from Jade: have you guys thought about working with the Māori Party?
Kia ora, Jay. I mean, I think the short answer to that is that we have thought about working together with the Māori Party. You'll know this a lot better than I do, Geoff, so maybe you can once again jump in and tell me if I'm wrong. But there's a lot of shared kaupapa between TOP and the Māori Party. We both are quite interested in addressing some of the market failures that have caused that are causing people to have kind of shit lives. Having to spend all of this money on housing, healthcare, suffering from diseases, suffering from a lack of education and lack of opportunities. And we're also both quite committed to the principles of te tiriti in a way which I don't think many of the other parties are, certainly not Labour and National. You've seen what Labour has done, for example, of the foreshore and seabed debate, and how they were really offside with Māori during the Clark years for that. TOP believes in the principles of te tiriti as New Zealand's founding document, that it is an agreement between two peoples, and we agree that we've overstepped it in so many ways. We need to make sure and we are coming at this from a sort of a Pākehā perspective. We're mostly in this party coming from a Pākehā background, not all, of course. But the party's kaupapa itself is from the Crown side rather than from an iwi side. And it sort of offends our honour to be being such poor treaty partners, or at least that's how I feel. And I think that's sort of a view shared by the TOP caucus, is that we need to be doing better by Māori, the people with whom we have signed an agreement, and we have mostly been the ones to break that agreement and dishonour it. And our policy around water is, of course, a prime example of that. How we want to absolutely, day one, recognise iwi claims over water, and proceed from the basis that they really have the ownership and the kaitiaki of this resource.
Kia ora, Ben. Great answer. I think obviously it's we continue to build our relationship with the Māori Party, and will hopefully continue to do so after the election. So
can I wish best of luck to any Māori Party candidates who are listening in on this conversation? I hope you guys all win your electorate seats.
Yeah, absolutely, and hope to be sitting with you around the cabinet table after October the 17th.
Definitely.
So, hey, well, thank you very much, Ben. That brings us to a close for
today. Geoff, and thanks for all the people in the audience. Thanks for those of you who asked questions.
Yeah, and great work, mate. Good luck in Hutt South.
Thank you.
In
Hutt South, there is a public debate on tomorrow evening at the Hutt City Library. So come and see me there, and come up and say hello afterwards if you're keen.
Nice one. Thanks, buddy. Ka kite anō.
Kia ora. Ka kite.